You're watching Co-op for Two. My name is Jesse Reichler. And we're continuing our series on Gumshoe, the 1985 rare out-of-print detective game based on the Sherlock Holmes consulting detective system. In previous videos, I've recorded 3 playthroughs of the first 3 days of Gumshoe, each about 6 hours long or so. Then there's an hour-long slow, detailed unboxing because this is such a rare game and so hard to get. I went through all of the components in detail. Then I made a review which went a little long. It was about 30 minutes where I just talk about sort of my thoughts, my overall thoughts on the game. Okay, so this video is going to be a more detailed look at the mechanics of Gumshoe. This would be mainly for maybe people who've already played it or want someone to talk to about the game, to just go through some thoughts, think out loud, and to look at it from a sort of game design perspective. So I'm not going to rehash the stuff in those reviews. Go watch the first review if you're interested in the overall picture and the mechanics and how it differs. This one, we're going to jump straight into the meat of the system. Okay, so let's talk about the clue point system. This is one of the major ways that it diverges from Sherlock Holmes. On each day, we've got a list of possible clue locations on the map that we could look up. It's not technically just locations on the map. You can see for July 3rd, the first 3 quarters are locations on the map. Then there's an entry to look at a piece of evidence that we're told about in the introduction to the case. And then there are a couple of places that might have locations on the board but are referenced by their name, like go to the newspaper headquarters, go to City Hall, go to our detective agency, go check FBI records. It's a little more flexible system. And then you can see also that it's got some locations that aren't in San Francisco proper that you have to travel to. So it sends you to a page 100, which has a chart here of travel times to get from any of these 28 little locations to each other. It tells you how much time it takes you, and as you know, there's a whole time mechanic in this game. All right, so let's think about this clue point system, how it differs from Sherlock Holmes's look up locations, what works and what doesn't. So I guess the first thing is the flexibility of this system of having not just addresses, but things like pieces of evidence and locations outside of San Francisco. If a story wanted to add a place in New York that you could travel to or make a phone call to, they could just add it right there and you would just look up that page to do it. That's a nice little touch to the Sherlock Holmes. There's no reason that in the beginning of each Sherlock Holmes case it couldn't say, here are 5 different things you could look up. But they don't tend to do it. I'm not sure exactly why. The use of actual addresses is interesting. It does make it feel like there's more of a real open world here. But there are other things that happen where you're in this whole giant world, and when new places come up on a day, you're like, oh, that's fascinating. Now I can explore Chinatown. Or, oh, that's interesting. Now we've opened up a whole bunch of places right around where this one house is. It gives you a different little bit of dopamine when new places open up. In regular Sherlock Holmes, it's all available. You can go to every place anytime you want. And it's a little bit of how, if you look at Dave Neal's latest expansion for Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, it has a system where after you gain some information, you get, like, it tells you to mark the letter M on your evidence list. So then you'll go to a location, it'll say if you don't have the M, you don't see anything here. So that's one way of saying, like, there's certain locations that won't be useful until later. One of the ways this game does it is it just doesn't put locations on your list that you shouldn't be going to yet, which is satisfying. It is fun, and it is fun to be like, oh, that's that guy's house. Now we can go there. And it's fun when you discover a location, like you're like, I don't know what this is. And then you find some guy's location and you're like, oh, that's 151 Turk, and here it is here. Let's go there. So it gives you a little more excitement when you unlock what these things mean. Now, there's a downside to that. And the downside, one of the downsides is it leaks information. It's impossible not to look at this list when you're playing and be like, here's a place right on this street, and I feel like I've been given a hint that I have to go there, right? You know these are relevant clues. And in fact, in general, some of the better Sherlock Holmes cases have lots of sprinkled clues that are just there for fun or diversion or as red herrings to throw you off the track. There's much less of that in Gumshoe. There are very few clues that are there just for red herrings. There are some. There's some that take you down some path where you get beat up and lose a couple hours of time. But much less of it. Same thing with newspaper. Much fewer little red herrings in the newspaper. Lots more text to wade through, and 99% of it is irrelevant. That's a little bit of a miss for this game. Sherlock Holmes, especially Dave Neal, love to use the newspaper. There's tons of little stuff and little clever things happening with the newspaper, and fun things, like there'll be little personals in the newspaper. You can go visit those people just to talk to them for the fun of it. There's very little of that in Gumshoe. There are lots of narrative discussions you get into with people that might not be that important for your case, but they're almost all in locations that are relevant for you and not little red herrings. So leaking information, you're looking at this, you're like, oh, okay, I know it's got to be someplace near there. Or you're looking at a place and you're like, oh, well, that had a different clue the day before, so I know that's important for me to go to. Now, the counterpoint to that, though, is that if you're a completionist like I am, when I play Sherlock Holmes, I want to find all the leads that are relevant. You can't really do that in Sherlock Holmes. You don't know until, like, you couldn't look up every location on the board, and you don't know what locations are relevant. So you're sort of, if you want to make sure you've got everything, you have to think very hard about, well, is there a location that I haven't figured out is relevant to me? And then let me look that up. And by the time you get to the end of the case, if you're doing that, if you're really trying to find everything, you're frequently looking up something in the book and being like, oh, that location's not in the book. There's no entry for that clue in my case book. And you're doing that a lot. Like in Sherlock Holmes, if you watch some of my playthroughs, at the end, when I'm running out of leads, I'm like, could it be here? Let me look that up. Okay, I'm going to look up all the pharmacies. Is 53 Southwest in the book? No. Is 22 Southwest in the book? No. And you have to look it up. And sometimes it takes a while to find locations in that book because they're alphabetical, 4 different neighborhoods by number, or 5 different neighborhoods. Here, you just look it up here. So if you're looking at pharmacies, you've got a list in your yellow pages of the pharmacies. And you're like, okay, let me just see if they're on this list. 3701 Sacramento, and they're alphabetical in the clue book, so you can very quickly rule out some places. And if you are a completionist like I am, and you like figuring out everything, if you're here for the narrative, it gives you some options. These are like little hints. But so when I played it, what I did is I went through, I said, okay, I found all the locations that I know what they refer to, right? So I wouldn't go to a location if I didn't know why it was relevant. But you've got a couple clues to tell you. First of all, you if you read about a place or you knew about a place, I marked it. So I gave up trying to keep my components pristine. It's too big, too epic a thing to not make notes everywhere. So I wrote everywhere. So I would note locations that I know how they're relevant. And I would note when I continue from one day to the next, I would transfer the places that I know are relevant. When you find a location, it's frequently in the next couple days also available. I would note when the clue had changed from day to day. So then I would be left with, okay, which ones don't I know what they are? So I'll have a list of places that I don't know how they're relevant. I would leave those aside, go to the ones I knew, and then some of them are informants, so I'd mark all those. After I went to all the places I knew, which would frequently give me information on others, I'd learn some information, and then I'd say, okay, 685 McAllister, I know what that is now, so I'd make a little mark. So after you run down all the leads you know, you'll have marked most of the clues, but some will still remain unmarked. Then you're faced with a decision. Well, what does that mean? I should be able to figure out, you should be able to figure out how that's relevant to today's lead. But now it may have been from information that you got 2 days ago, so it's very tricky. So that having some blank things you don't know what they are might make you say, well, all right, well, maybe I can find where this guy worked. So let me look him up, let me look his boss up, and then you'll be able to resolve a couple more, and there'll still be some that you weren't able to resolve, and then you've got another decision there. What should you do at that point? For me, frequently what I did was I would look up if it's the same clue on the next day. Like, is this a clue that you have a couple days to find? So after I ran out of ways to unlock most of the remaining leads, I'd look. If it's available on the next day, I just left it unexplored. Now, if it's not available on the next day, or if it changed on the next day, that's a much bigger incentive to look at it. Occasionally, if I really hit a dead end, if I spent 6 hours on a day and could not figure out how it's relevant, I would give a little peek at it. Didn't do that on the first couple of days, but as I got to day 4, day 5, day 6, I would give a little peek and I would see if I could get a hint as to what it was a lead about, and then I would stop and go back and say, okay, it is about this person's work. Let me try to chase down that lead. And again, I made notes everywhere. Okay, that's looking up leads. Now, this clue book was fantastic. The variety of things in this clue book. Occasionally in Sherlock Holmes, you'll get like a note in the case book, in the clues. This one is just filled with that kind of stuff, filled with handwritten notes, with extra lab reports, extra fingerprints all over the place, constant use of fingerprints, constant use of little sub maps and branching, constant branching. I mean, I knew to expect a little bit of it. Do you want to go here? Do you want to do this? You're faced with this choice. Some guy approaches you. Do you want to run? Do you want to fight him? But there is a ton of it. And it's very thematic. It's very fun. From a game perspective, it's hard to... It represents a real dilemma. And it's a dilemma because there's no easy way to... You have a choice. You can either say, when I get to this branch, I'm only going to follow one branch and never go down this other path. Now, if you do that, then your decisions are weighty. You're like, should I do this? Should I do this? There's going to be consequences for my decision. But as with many of these games, in fact, almost all of these detective games have this thing where you're not making a decision based on just logic. It's not like, well, if you're smart, you'll know to go down this path. It's a decision based on narrative and theme and what feels right. So you can't be making right decisions. And as a gamer, that can be very frustrating. You're like, well, it's a shot in the dark. One way I'm going to get hit over the head. The other way I'm going to open up an important lead of this case. And if you're a completionist, if you like the narrative, if you want to hear everything, you will not be satisfied only going down one path. And I think if you probably tried to go down one path, you'd be very frustrated trying to solve these cases. So you're going to have a choice you have to make about how to play this game. Furthermore, in Gumshoe, it's not balanced for the number of players. If you play it solo, the game is clear, and everyone who's played it is very clear. You're going to have to play each day multiple times. You simply don't have enough time to play through a day once from 9 a.m. till 10 p.m., most clues taking 15 minutes to an hour. You will not get enough information each day if you're just a solo player. If you play with multiple detectives, multiple players at the table, one person will go through one set of paths, another person will go through another. And I played it solo, so I had to replay days. The first playthrough of each day, I kept very close track of the time as it was going by, and I made decisions as best as I can. Do you want to do this? Do you want to do that? After I played through a full day, which might take 4 or 5 hours, best case 3 hours, then I would go back and play the day again, much more loosely worrying about time, more going where I wanted to go. And I think that's the best advice I could give you about playing it, is to sort of play the first day strictly. And so if you stake out a place, you might spend your whole day staking out. And then when you play again, go through these different paths. And the game you're playing is that it's not a game of now making the perfect choice when you get to branches. The game is more, can you keep good enough records to keep track of all these branching paths? And it will be a challenge, and it's a different kind of challenge, but I do think it's still satisfying. Now, if you do decide to play it with multiple players, which I normally don't do, it would be a different experience. I am very curious to hear how people play this with 2 or 3. I know there are a couple people who've played it with 2 or 3 players on BGG that have wrote about their reports. And you could imagine it would be a different experience with different people going different paths and saying, hey, you stake up that place and I'll go track down these leads. But it does worry me because one action might be, okay, you got hit on the head, wake up tomorrow. Now you're just sitting for 4 hours of gameplay while the rest of the detectives do their turns. And a turn can take some time looking up some information. So I'm skeptical about how well it would play that way. Overall, the time element is fascinating. From a game design perspective, it's fascinating to watch. And if you can get yourself into the mindset of sort of just imagining that certain things are taking time and you're backing up and replaying, if you're okay with that, then it's very cool. But I can see it being frustrating to people who are gamey and feel like the decisions should be sort of based on how well you can figure something out, because that's not what it's going to be like. Okay, let's see. We've talked about the time element. It's possible with the right group it could work, but again, you're going to have a group that's willing to put 50 hours into it. There are other ways you could play this time element. I'm curious if someone, because it's 9 days worth of cases, it's hard to advise someone to play the whole thing, but you could try playing the first day until time runs out, second day time runs out, and playing those 9 days, and then starting back over at the beginning and playing them and taking different courses. But it's too big. It's so big, it's hard to recommend that. So that's the one thing I wish I could give you better advice on how to play it. But I don't know. You're just going to have to do what feels right to you. And some of the actions really could, if you go down a certain path, you would end the day after one playthrough with having gathered no information. That's scary. Okay. Let's talk about the maps in general. So I started out, when I played the first day, there are certain things that happened that I started putting my markers down and trying to track everything that was happening on the map. By the time I got to the 5th or 6th day, I was basically playing without paying any attention to the map. And this second map of the outskirts, I think I used once, and just for thematic reasons to track where I was traveling in this long car chase. But essentially, thematic atmosphere, but not very important for gameplay. The lab reports and the autopsies, however, are very important. They're very readable. They're atmospherically perfect. There are things that are like sloppy about the signatures and the handwriting and stuff that make it feel real. But there are little details there that that are successful when you spot them. There are moments in this game where you figure something out and you're like, oh, I get it. I figured out what was happening. I talked about the fingerprints in the review. The fingerprints are so well done. It makes me feel like they must have licensed some like fingerprint official book on how to read fingerprints, like a classroom book, because they're each different enough that you're, in the end, you're never confused about what matches what. But they're all unique enough to feel real. They're all classified. You can, if you will figure out how to classify things. They're not ambiguous. It gets to the point where you can start classifying fingerprints very quickly. It's very satisfying to have this sense of mastery over this activity of classifying and looking at fingerprints. And it's again this element where maybe the game shouldn't work because it feels like you're just doing sort of rote work, but there's something satisfying about having mastered it and being able to do it. Let's see, the reports, there's a little bit of confusion about when the reports should be available. The general consensus seems to be on BGG that you can read a report anytime on that day after it's marked. Some of the reports have times, then it's clear you're allowed to read it that day after that time. Some don't have times. And some of the reports were available before I heard about this case, like a body would come up before I heard about it elsewhere. And occasionally it seems like that's how it should have been, that, you know, like you found a John Doe body in the lake, and then later you find out what that's relevant. And then other cases, it felt like I should not have had access to that body. So in general, when in doubt, I didn't look at a body. Like if I looked at it and I said, I don't know anything about that, I put it off for one day. And then if it came up later that day, I would look at it. If it didn't come up, I would look at it on the next day. The newspapers were a missed opportunity, I would say. I mean, there's very little in the newspapers that are relevant for the case. And most of it, when they are relevant to some of your cases, have no information that's relevant for you. So it's much more of just a thematic thing. It is very cool to see a case in day one have newspaper articles that come up on the second day, third day, fourth day. All of the cases span a contiguous sequence of 9 days. So it's very fun to see the newspapers continue. And occasionally there's something relevant. But for the most part, overwhelmingly, the newspapers are just a huge amount of information to read and are not relevant to your case. So that's a missed opportunity, and missed opportunity for like flavor text, like some of the Sherlock Holmes. You'll go to places and you'll just get something funny from that. So a little bit of a tough slog to go through the newspapers. Let's see, what else? The telephone books. Telephone books, very well done, very comprehensive. There are some puzzles, just like in Sherlock Holmes. They're like, well, they worked at this kind of place, so maybe if I check out those places. The fact that there are actually, most of it is San Francisco, but then there are like 8 other little miniature cities that each have a page, added an extra little challenge. Like if there was a name you wanted to look up, you're sometimes asking yourself, is it worth the effort to go look that name in all the cities? And I've talked about this before in some of these reviews, but I really appreciate that sort of realism and sort of stamina challenge. It's as if you said, well, here's this mystery. You have to, it's like when they track down real serial killers. If I go to you and you're the detective and I say, well, here are all these great leads, you know, like there's where the gun was purchased, here's the fingerprint. And then I said, or you can go through 1,000 parking tickets from that week. Or you could go through 1,000 hours of security camera footage from the buildings nearby. You'd say, well, I'm going to chase down the most important leads first. Right? Then after you run those down and you don't get anywhere, you say, well, okay, let me check the security footage for that day. And you don't find anything. In a big case, the police will say, well, we're going to have to start digging for needles in haystacks. So give me 2 more men and have them looking at security footage going back a week. Maybe we'll catch the guy casing the joint a week ago or 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. Or maybe it's time to trace down every owner of a white hatchback. It's too much work in the beginning, but as you run out of information. And I really appreciate that decision element in these games that's saying, well, maybe you're going to have to do the real shoe leather work of looking up and knocking on every door of someone with that last name. And I like this sort of realism element that it asks you, are you willing to do that work? How badly do you want to solve this case? How badly are you willing to put in 2 hours of work for a 1% chance that it's relevant to your case? And Gumshoe embraces that. So the white pages has a little element of that, which is great. Everything's in there that you need. The yellow pages, again, just like Sherlock Holmes, you're rewarded for sort of knowing the different places you could look up. So I would advise you, study this a bit, learn what places you could go to. I love the little details here about you've got ads in addition to all the locations, right? Little flavor stuff all over this game. And the sheer scope, everything is epic in scope. The newspapers, the phone books, the maps, the reports, everything is epic. And the phone books are great about that. Okay, let's talk about the puzzles a bit, the sort of deductive mystery-solving puzzles. I said in my review that I don't think they're up to the caliber of the better Sherlock Holmes mysteries. The Sherlock Holmes mysteries feel like they've got that sort of twist at the end, the good ending twist of a murder mystery movie, where you're like, aha, it's this, or ha, it's the murder weapon is hidden in the fireplace, right? Those little elements. This is a much more sort of run-of-the-mill solution to many of these cases, and they get solved by detective work, by normal, hard, running down all the alibis detective work. And they don't feel like, some of these puzzle games, like these exit games, are a little bit sometimes mathematical, like that the killer had a hat, and he was tall, and he was wearing black shoes, and so let me rule out these people for this, and rule out these people for this, and rule out these people for this, and the one that's left, you've deduced that it must be the killer must be this person because of all these mathematical constraints. That doesn't really happen in this game. In this game, you're getting lots of fingerprints, lots of different information, and then eventually over the days, you're narrowing it down and confirming it more and more. But it's still very satisfying because you're given this narrative story along the way. I will say that one of the things that disappointed me a little, if the game is all about narrative and story, I was a little let down by the sort of wrap-ups of these stories. In Sherlock Holmes, especially the later boxes, you get a very elaborate explanation of the story. And in Gumshoe, all of the questions and stories are in this little book. So you're given the questions at the end of each day, which you can read, but then the answers are here. But they're quite short. There's very little flavor in them. And for the most part, things end undramatically. Like you track down the culprits, and it just gives you one paragraph about how you found them and they're arrested. And after 5 days of tracking someone down and figuring out all the leads and tracing down the alibis, I wanted a little showdown. I wanted our guy to give his little narrative, smoking his cigarette, putting someone in their place, and the guy saying, you know, you got me, copper, like a Scooby-Doo if it weren't for those meddling kids. I wanted more of those moments. That was a missed opportunity in this game, and I'm not sure, I mean, so much was written in all of these cases, you could imagine that they sort of burned out at the end, but I would have loved a little bit more wrap up for each little story. Let's see. We talked about the way you can get hints in this game. Almost makes it a little better for someone who's a completionist, because you know now you can not move on until you find all of these places. You can say, I'm missing 3 locations, and I like that. I found that very satisfying, that I could know these are 3 locations I must find before I move on. So I knew by the time I got to the end of this that I had seen everything for every day. And that, whether that's important to you or not, is going to depend on you. For me, though, that was satisfying. I guess, I mean, I've talked plenty about it, but it does pay to say again how well written this is. It's not like a novel. It isn't that quality of wrapping things up, but you don't want that. You would get tired of reading pages and pages of dialogue and narrative constantly. So it's in little snippets, but it's so well balanced between when it should give you just a little, here are the facts, a little piece of information, and when it doles out these occasional full page narratives. And it's such an expert hand. And when you play these detective games and these kinds of games, you realize how hard that is to do. I mean, Dave Neal did it really, really well in his Baker Street Irregulars box. But it is not an easy thing to do, to make a compelling narrative that you dish out in appropriately sized chunks that don't get boring, and that convey atmosphere concisely. And this game was full of that. There were people that were in danger that I cared about, and there were moments where I was just like, whoa, that just happened, or I can't believe that person said that. So fun, but not perfect. Not perfect. There were some missed opportunities. I would have liked to see some recurring characters with personalities come back. It had an opportunity to have some sort of big bad villains that felt scary and dangerous, and there was a little bit of missed opportunity there. A little bit of missed opportunity. And I talked about the abrupt endings and stuff. Yeah, so, but overall, very, very good. I guess we should wrap up by just talking a little bit about whether this campaign, it's exhausting. It was exhausting to play through 9 days. By the time I got to the 5th or the 6th day and had to read through this newspaper, it was getting tiring. And it would be, I think, in Dave Neal's box, which I haven't played the last 5 cases, but they are, I think he's trying to do a little bit of where they continue, but each case still is its own little mystery that gets solved while it's also continuing. And I think that might be a more satisfying, palatable way to get through it. This is really for someone who wants the type 2 fun, which is sort of like when you're riding your bike beyond what you're comfortable doing. It's painful and exhausting, like a marathon. And then you get back, and the next day it was fun. It was fun because it was so exhausting and epic and strenuous. And that's half the fun in this game. So I guess that wraps it up. I mean, you heard my review. I'm very positive about this. I do think it's for a very special kind of person, not for everyone. But it's fascinating from a game design perspective. Absolutely worth it to try if you're interested in the game design of these detective games. I would put it at the very top in terms of unique experience. I rated it a 9, not a 10. Not as good as Dave Neal's best Sherlock Holmes cases, But as an experience and as a sort of example of what happens when someone is so ambitious, as an experiment, as an achievement, it is like a work of art and absolutely worth trying out if you like these systems. And I'll be back for one more video, of the shortest video I make of the Gumshoe, where I just talk about how I would approach this game if I was playing it, if you're advice for someone who's about to play Gumshoe. So I'll see you in that video. And I really, if you've played Gumshoe, I really want to hear about it. I want to talk more about it. This is one of these games that you want to talk to people about. So I'll see you in the comments and in the next video. Bye.